Welcome to Read Poems Every Day. Today we're going to get to know the poem of the day on Poetry Daily's website. The poem is Nostalgia by Christine Roseeta Walker. This is a new to me poem that appears in her collection Cocoa Island, published in 2024. It was shortlisted for a few major poetry prizes, including the Derek Walcott Prize for Poetry in 2025. I do want to point out something about the book's description because it's something that doesn't get brought up a lot in some of the videos I've been doing. And it doesn't get brought up when studying poetry because poems tend to be studied as individual um, works of art as opposed to what is called here a compelling cycle of poems. Note that that's a different way of talking about a group of poems, not a collection, but a cycle. The idea of a cycle suggests that the poems in the collection in the book are related to each other and share at the very least maybe a set of images. And given the title of the poem, title of the collection rather, title of the book, it does suggest that it might have something to do with place. And that place, I think, we're introduced to in this poem. So let's read it out loud, and then we'll work through however much of my process of getting to know a poem we can work through today. I am hoping at someday to get in the habit of doing a long form video where I do actually walk through the whole process in one go. But usually I get a little sheepish around the 25-minute mark, and I want to start wrapping it up. Okay, so here it is. Walker's Nostalgia. I'm being called back to my childhood, to the dirt road fading into the marled hill, to the place where the steel drums grew out of the red clay, where the yam vines became skipping ropes and katas for our heads. I'm being summoned back to the bush where the mangoes are worth the 5-mile walk in the heat, and the fear of cows sending us back through the field over the stone wall that ends where our eyes cannot reach. I'm being demanded back to the beach, the pears, the bula cakes, I think, the soft drink bottles selling for $1, and the handballs, the cricket in the front yard, and the fights I always win, I will always win. I'm being given back to you, to the land of my birth, to the childhood of my past, to the to the mother, father, and the sisters who longed to say, sit, me we plait, you hair. I'm being handed back to you, my childhood home. Okay, so here's the bio of the poet, in case you're reading this on your own and want to learn more about her. Where did I get tripped up in my reading? We can work backwards. I switched around mother and father. I think my eyes saw father. We're sort of scanning ahead, and it sort of came out of my mouth before mother. I skipped over will. The fights I always win, I wanted to say. Will always win. Okay. What else? I think I mispronounced bula cakes the first time, although I might be wrong about exactly how to pronounce it. It was that it. I might have slipped up a few other places, but I think that might be it. And then, of course, I didn't even attempt the dialect here. I just sort of read it straight. But you can tell how the writing of it sort of gets you into a certain rhythm. Sit, me we play to you hair. You see, I can't even. The rhythm of it's different, and I want to sort of um, pull it back into my own dialect, as it were. But let's try to do it. Sit, me we plait, you hair. Yeah, so that's how you do it. That's the rhythm anyway. Hmm. I probably have that rhythm wrong. And to be clear, of course, I'm not trying to imitate an accent, just to kind of see how the spelling and the words used kind of get you into a rhythm. Okay, so that's reading aloud. Let's count some beans. I was joking with friends yesterday that I might just um what was I going to call it? That I might change the name of the channel from Read Poems Every Day to um just something about counting commas, I think is what we called it. Um anyway, counting commas. Let's see. In terms of lines, the poet makes it pretty easy for us. It's a 20-line poem, and I know that because there are four stanzas, um, each 5 lines long. And I do remember my basic times tables, so 4 times 5. So we have 20 lines. That'll also make it pretty easy to track the line numbers. 20-line poem, 4 stanzas, each 5 stanzas long. What about the line length? I'm being called back to my childhood. Let's skip ahead to another line. The pears, the bula cakes, the soft drink. Of my birth to the childhood of my past. So there is, yeah, so the lines vary in length, but not by much. So we're thinking sort of 8 to 10 beats. And then if we were tracking stresses, it's possible that there's even less variation in terms of the number of stressed beats in a line. This is something you learn when reading someone like Gerard Manley Hopkins, whose whose poetry sometimes in let me see, the lines of his poems vary sometimes so dramatically in length. But if you count out the stresses, they do tend to still follow, um, at times at least, a kind of iambic pattern. Okay, 20-line poem, some variation length. What about enjambment? What are we looking at here? Okay, so we have, let's just kind of do a quick look over and see. It looks like there's quite a few instances of enjambment, but it's not uniform. So thinking just about this first stanza, you have the first and fifth lines you have a punctuated pause, but the second, third, and fourth lines 2 through 3, or 2 through 4, lines 6 through 9. I mean, now this is interesting because you have the looks more like a M. It's a M dash than a hyphen, but it's certainly shorter than this M. Looks like an N dash, but it's certainly shorter than this M dash. But even though there's a punctuation mark there's no pause, and the handballs you read straight through. So that's still, to my mind, enjambment, but it sort of cuts a word in half, or catches a word in the middle of itself. Uh, but even so that's lines 12 through 14, and then lines 16 through 18. So that's quite a few. 3 lines here, 4 lines here, 6, 7, 8, 9, 3 lines here and here. So that's quite a few lines. Um, so be hill, two, drums, grew, yam, vines. And so each of those enjambments are very different. Where from line 2 to 3, the enjambment happens sort of at the end of a prepositional phrase and before the beginning of a second one. The second enjambment cuts at a subject and predicate pivot, and then same thing here, where it's subject and verb, where the yam. Oh no! Here cuts at an adjective and noun. The yam vines, so a sort of compound noun phrase there. That's sort of cut in the middle. Sometimes I don't think I've spent much time sort of differentiating those decisions a poet might make, but I think it is helpful to get a sense of what difference it might make, where that where that enjambment happens within the syntax of what's being written, and how your eyes and your voice have to get trained as you read it out loud to track those cuts, even if if they happen when they happen, say at the end of a prepositional phrase. That's actually quite easy because it feels like the end of a cluster. It's a little trickier when it happens here, when it cuts an adjective and noun, because especially when that adjective it can itself out of context be a noun. So enjambments can sometimes make it a little unclear what part of speech that word at the end of a line actually is. Of course, that uncertainty maybe just lasts a second or two, half a second, but you can kind of get a sense of that. Okay, almost 11 minutes in, and we aren't past enjambment. Okay, enjambment, punctuation. What are we looking at here? So apostrophe, line 1. Any other apostrophes? Line 1, line 6. Uh-oh, we're noticing a pattern. Line 6, line 11, and line 16. Of course, just tracking the apostrophe led us to notice that there's a sort of anaphoric repetition at the beginning of each stanza. We'll maybe come back to that. Under sound and sense, repetition at the beginning of each stanza. I'm being. Does stanza 4 begin that way too? I'm being, yes. Yes. I'm being verbed. um, okay. So apostrophe occurs at least in those. Any other? I don't see any other apostrophes. I can go back and add that in if we need to. So that's apostrophe, period, at the end of line 1, line 5, line 10. Sort of noticing a pattern here. Of course, line 15, then line 19 and line 20. So in the two middle stanzas, there's only one period in the stanzas, and it's at the very end. Periods at the end of the first and fourth stanza as well. But then you also have periods in the penultimate line and in the first line as well. So a little bit of variation there, and I missed completely this period. So there's also a period in line 4. Okay. Again, possible I missed other ones. No others. There's apostrophes and periods in the first stanza, but that's it. Move on to second stanza. We have a hyphen in line 7. So that forms the compound 5 mile. So that compound adjective. You have the bula cakes in line 12. And then it's unclear here. It's not really, maybe that's an n dash because this is meant to be one word. So we have an n dash in line 13. So that's different than a hyphen, which fuses together two words. Handballs is just one word, one word that's being broken by the line break. And so if I'm understanding the punctuation and how it's differing from the hyphens, that's why this mark is a little bit different than this one. And it's certainly different than this one because we have an M dash then in line 15 and the last line, line 20. So you're seeing that it's starting to get more complicated in terms of punctuation by the time you reach the last stanza, last two stanzas. You have no, I've done this before. I'm like, you have no commas. And then I look back and I've missed like 4 of them. I don't think there are any commas in the first 10 lines, but then we get into this last two stanzas, the second half, and there are suddenly very dramatically. Commas. Let's count them. Counting commas. Good band name. One. So in line 12, and there's two of them there. Line 13 and line 14. And then skipping to the last stanza, there's one in line 16, 17, 18, there's two of them. 19, there's two of them. Right. Also missed that there's an apostrophe in the final line there. What else? Quotation marks. When you first read this poem, you don't realize how potentially interesting it is to track the punctuation because it seems just kind of so descriptively straightforward. The poem's purpose seems pretty straightforward, and the structure seems so uniform that you may initially miss the way in which the poet, as she moves into the later stanzas, is actually introducing quite a lot of syntactic variation, a lot of variation in lineation as well. Quotation marks in line 19 then as well. That's almost everything, I think. I'm sure I've missed something. I don't think we've talked about a poem yet where I had to differentiate between a hyphen, an n dash, and an m dash. So that's exciting. Absolutely exciting. Okay, so pronouns then. Pronouns. See if I can. No, I don't want to do that. Pronouns then. So mostly have. Oh, no, we do. Right, so we have first person singular pronoun, singular in line 1, of course, and then the same lines as the apostrophes, line 6, 11, 16, and 20. But let's see if there are other lines where we have plural third, we have a third person, not third person, we have a first person plural pronoun here, our. So it's line 5. I suddenly sort of was blipping about the kind of categories of pronoun that I've sometimes apply here. Makes me a little worried. There's another instance of an us. So there's the plural again there. So that's line 9. Another reference to first person singular in line 15. Just trying to make sure. There's the our eyes in line 10. Okay. We have the second person then in line 16. I'm being given back to you, to the land of my birth. So there's another first person singular, my birth, my past. The plural again in line 19, but that appears in quotation. So there it's not the speaker using we, it's the father, mother, and the sisters. I think it's the sisters there. And second person is also there in the quote. And then the U is again in line 20. So again, something that starts as what appears to be an initially pretty straightforward poem when you start to track the pronouns, a certain sort of situation begins to emerge here. Um, the pronouns work with the relatively straightforward title, nostalgia. In other words, it's the sort of the experience of nostalgia, which is a sort of first person experience, kind of longing for the past. Hmm. Longing for a place, longing for people, longing for a state of affairs that has sort of passed us by, or that is no longer present for us. And so my point about pronouns then is that it sort of demonstrates that play, the speaking from the first person, but then that shift to first person plural is what really that sort of slide from first person singular to first person plural. That's the slide of nostalgia, right? Because first person singular is I'm being called back to my childhood, whereas those third person pronouns, the our heads, the our eyes, sending us back, this sort of collective experience now, that's located in the past. That's located in the past. But interestingly, the you has to do with the land. So the second person address in the final stanza is to the land. The quoted second person address is to the speaker. And same thing here. To a slide from a land to a home. So that's also pretty interesting. Okay. I hope that makes sense. That I'm not kind of going a little nuts here. Um, Not sure I have anything else to really say about beans, but that sounds good. What about sound and sense? So I already noted the repetition at the beginning of each stanza and the final line. I'm being verbed as I put it there. What about anything else? Let's listen. Let's listen again to the first stanza. I'm being called back to my childhood, to the dirt road fading in the marled hill, to the place where the steel drums grew out of the red clay, where the yam vines became skipping ropes and katas for our heads. I mean, you do have certain sonic patterns that sort of you can that come through when you read it out loud. I mean, they're not. It's not. The poem doesn't strike me as relishing in alliteration, but there are certain clusters, right? The D sounds of dirt, road, fading, right? And that comes not too long after childhood, which has two of those sounds in it. And then of course there's drums, but drums feels a little further off there. So it's lines 1 to 2. Again, I'm not going to kind of go through the whole thing, but then you have the multiple plural nouns in line 5, right? Vines, ropes, katas, heads, right? So you that just that something as simple as having a bunch of plural nouns in one line, doing that then also introduces a certain sound pattern, at least at the sort of combination at the ends of those words. Hmm. I think you do have then the B sounds of being back. bush from line 6. Where the mangoes are worth the 5 miles. So you have the combo sort of um, WM pattern of where mangoes worth mile. It's line 7. And then the walk there. Line 8. Okay. More B sounds of beach, of being, beach, bula cakes, bottles, um, and balls. Right. So that's lines 11 through 14. Yeah, so each of the stanzas has this sort of pretty subtle, not sort of um, overly oh, not an overemphasis on alliteration, and by that I don't mean I don't mean that poems that use alliteration are doing a bad thing, but it doesn't actually stand out as language that wouldn't also just be part of everyday speech. But when you take a second look, you notice and can appreciate these patterns. That the B sound seems to really stand out at the beginning of stanzas 2, 3, and 4, being given back to you to the land of my birth. So you have that triple alliteration there, or the triple repetition of the B sound. Okay, so those are lines 16 to 17 then. Okay, so that's just tracking alliteration anyway. That's what we have there. I don't think there are any end rhymes. Even in poems that might not be following a rhyme scheme, you'll occasionally see end rhymes that are developed for a certain kind of effect, but we don't see that here. So okay, so how do we develop then the prose sense of the poem? Now that we've kind of learned to appreciate the sound system a little bit, appreciate some of the way the poem uses repetition, the repetition of phrases to structure itself and organize itself into stanzas and lines. It's compelling use of a slide between first person singular, first person plural pronouns that really kind of sets and again and organizes the effect of nostalgia, plugging into and amplifying that title. Okay, let's go back to the beginning then. Stanza 1. Straightforward statement. Statement. Straightforward, I'll put in question marks. Question mark. Statement about a recollection of childhood. And some. We also then have a move from general spatial coordinates to a more specific form of child's play. Child's play, is that like that? I'm gonna leave it that way. Child's play. Okay, so you have the road and the hill, uh, and then you have some lines that think a little bit about um, things that start to occupy those places: the steel drums, um, the red clay. And I don't know if the red. I think maybe the red clay refers to the ground or to the walls. I'm not sure. Um, and then the way the sort of natural vegetation of the place end up becoming repurposed into toys for the children. And I'm not sure, katas are kind of wraps you put on your head when carrying things on your head. I think that's what that's referring to. Um, and so I don't know if that's play or work then, right? Because skipping ropes would be play. Katas might be referring to sort of playing at adult kinds of work, or maybe at the kind of work children are also then trained to do. Okay, so child's play or work. Hmm. Recollection of specific pleasures, earned ones, right? A 5 mile walk to eat a mango. Um, if you've eaten a fresh mango, I imagine you sort of that clicks for you. This was worth it, right? Recollection of pleasures, sensuous experience. So the heat of the sun, the physical exertion of the walk, um, emotion, say fear. Hmm. And perspective. So the idea when a child, when you look at something like a fence or a road, in your mind's eye, you probably think that it never ends. I think maybe if my grandparents lived on a small kind of farm property, and I say small because it wasn't thousands of acres or anything, but it was so much bigger, of course, than the sort of like town property, like the house I lived in and the backyard we had, front yard we had as a kid. Their property was so much bigger in comparison. It felt like it just went on forever. And since I lived in the country, I remember thinking the same thing about, say, the road that would continue past their house. I always wonder, sort of, this poem is helping me sort of think about how it felt like that road must just go forever because I didn't know, never experienced what was down it because we never had a reason to continue driving down that road. Uh, okay, not sure if that's what the poet's after, but that's what's clicking for me anyway. So I'm thinking about it. Let's make my notes a little bit bigger. Might be hard to see. Hmm. Stanza 3 seems more a recollection of leisure, right? The beach, the treats, the sports, contests, right? The fights, um, sense of competitiveness, which characterizes the place, but also the speaker. Hmm. But then we have a recollection of something a little more domestic, recollection of a family, but also an address that isn't to the family, but to the land and home. Land and home. All right. So in the poem, though, in the poem, the speaker feels a call to return, but does not actually return yet. Yet. Um, Again, this poem is brand new to me, like maybe an hour and a half ago. It was new to me, and so I haven't read any of the other poems in Walker's collection. But if it's a poetry cycle, it's very possible that the return is also wrapped up into the whole collection. Maybe not. Maybe not. All right. So beans, sound and sense. Let's think a bit about form and figures then. I know this is going long, but I do want to try to keep going. Form and figures. Each stanza has some uniform features. So they all begin with that repetition at the beginning. The location within an experience of the speaker with respect to the past, but also a place. Okay. So we have a sort of spatio-temporal um, situating that happens at the beginning of each stanza. And so we get that reinforcement stanza to stanza. But then that also means we have a series of verbs associated with um, nostalgia, right? So we have called back, summoned back, and then something. Would you say that it's getting? Would you say that it's getting more aggressive? Is the wrong word, but forceful, right? Because we move from just being called back to being summoned back to being demanded back, and then something. Is this softer? Given back. Hmm. Boy, that last one shifts, doesn't it? Called back, summoned back. That last one kind of complicates things, doesn't it? Because there's a way in which the first three you could maybe say that it is the place that's calling the speaker back, right? Being called back. Um, Note how it would change, right? I'm being called back to my childhood. If that too was a by, right? I'm being called back by my childhood. I'm being summoned back by the bush. I'm being demanded back by the beach. Um, that's not how she writes it, but that in some sense is how I was reading it and thinking of it, especially given the address to the land, to the home in the last stanza. But who's doing the giving here? Because the land can't give her to itself, can it? I mean, according to the logic of the poem, that seems like it wouldn't make sense. So that might be an open question, thinking ahead to ideas and questions. Who or what is doing the calling, summoning, demanding, and giving, right? And also the handing, right? Because we have the handing in, start the very busy screen here, the handing at the end here, okay? Handed back. So thinking about that, those aren't synonymous phrases, right? So if we were to think about form, which is another way of thinking, not just about arrangement, but also about relation and um, and how the parts of the poem pressure, qualify each other, creating connotation, creating that effect of what I like to call sort of maybe structural irony. Irony, again, not sarcasm, but the way in which what is meant is not simply located in what is said, but in the tensions and pressures, qualifications, um, and implications of what's being said and how it's being said. Let's go back here. I occasionally want to just click the post just in case. I think one time I lost everything I was writing. That made me very sad. Indeed. Each stanza. Okay, so uniform features like the repetition. Then you have the series of verbs kind of embedded in that repetition. In that repetition. What else? That slide from singular uh, to plural and back, right? Giving that dynamic. Um, what constitutes the form of nostalgia? It's a pretty wild book of film theory, I think called The Form of Affect. Um, the Form of Affect. There we go. There it is. So I'm wondering if that's something we could think about here. What constitutes the form of nostalgia? If we think of nostalgia as an affect that sort of organizes our experience of the world and something that affects how we read what's around us and how we remember what's around us. Everything being talked about here is being experienced, remembered through this emotion in some ways, or the emotion itself is this kind of remembering of it. Anyway, and that has something to do with that slide that the poem performs. Okay. The poem is also a kind of inventory of place, object, experience, emotion, relation. Each stanza is an inventory, contributing a certain angle to the fuller picture of this feeling. And this sense of transition, of movement, or let's say imminent movement, return. Okay. What about figurative language? What do we have here for figurative language? I mean, you don't really have, there's a way in which there's something kind of this image of the childish use of yam vines is such a lovely illustration of what figurative language does, but it doesn't seem itself an example of figurative language, right? You have the sort of imaginative use of an object for a purpose, in a way that it is not intended or designed to be used. Um, it's all in that kind of becoming, right? Becoming aspect. Hmm. What do you think, gang? Are there figures of speech here? It doesn't really seem to be. Seems to be a rather straightforward poem. We do have apostrophe. Let's think about figurative language then. Bold that so it'll be easier to see. We do have apostrophe in the last stanza, right? So if you think of apostrophe as a kind of figurative language, um, or a trope of figurative language, a turn of phrase that's doing something, doing something with language that is very different from everyday speech. The address to the land that is also slides into becoming a home in the last line, treating it as if it's an entity that can respond. Okay, we do have apostrophe in the final stanza. So we have that, and that's, apostrophe is so good at establishing a kind of vibe that in this case does a great job of again arranging and kind of helping the poem land its performance of this affect. Okay, so we do have apostrophe there. Okay, ideas and questions. I've already written some of these down. I don't want to kind of go rush past any in other instances of figurative language, but I don't see anything obvious that's standing out. Um, no. Okay. All right. So ideas and questions. Who or what is doing the calling, summoning, demanding, giving, handing? What constitutes? That's not quite how I want to ask that question. How do we describe the form of nostalgia? If emotions or affects have a shape to them, have an arrangement of their own, what is this poem theorizing or performing with respect to nostalgia? Which, if you remember, of course, is its title. Um, sort of might lead us back to think about some of these notes we've already taken and how that kind of fits with nostalgia. Hmm. Some questions we might ask then: is nostalgia? What's the relation between nostalgia and the imagination? Also, poesis. So making. Is nostalgia itself a kind of poetic activity or a poetic state of mind or state of being, poetic affect, right? Because it might encourage us to do the sorts of things that this poem does, right? Apostrophize the past, speak to something that is not itself present, making itself present. Um, what does one do when you get nostalgic? Um, you do speak in lists. You tell familiar stories. Becomes a kind of this language of nostalgia. One might say is a kind of language of the shorthand. So you think, for instance, of something that must have been lived dozens, if not hundreds of times, right? The walk to get mangoes, the experience of heat, the fear of cows. These are not individual moments or memories, but are kind of like memory clusters, uh, arguably anyway. Uh, okay, so we could think about that a little bit. Hmm. What do we make of the sisters, of their longing? It's possible that again because I don't know this for sure, but because the book's webpage describes it as a cycle, it's very possible we'll get some context for this in some of the other poems in the collection. But hmm, nostalgia is a kind of longing, right? So throughout the poem, it's a kind of longing for or a feeling of being called back to something. But then in this penultimate line, it's not the speaker who's doing the longing, but the sort of apostrophized sisters who longed to say sometime in the past, sit, me we plait you hair. Hmm. Is there anything to make of the, what do we call it, difference in sound and dialect between the speaker's voice and the voice of her sisters? And are they one voice? Why do they speak in one voice? Okay. These, of course, aren't necessarily great interpretive questions, but and maybe they're all kind of getting at some of the same aspects of the poem, but from different angles. So there are some things introduced by this last stanza that are interesting. And I wonder wonder what this one's about. The cricket in the front yard and the fights. The fights I will always win. Who's fighting? What does the sister's longing imply about the speaker's relation or past separation from the land, home, childhood, birth? Notice family is never mentioned. I'm going to regret typing that, aren't I? Family members are mentioned, of course, mother, father, the sisters who long to say. Why the sisters? Why not my sisters? Why the mother, father? Why not my? Just now noticing that. Why the mother, father, and the sisters? Not my? Right? Because we have my past, my birth, um, my childhood. So why the here? Okay. And the you is not the family members, but again, the land, the home, the home. Okay. I guess this is going to be my first long form video. What about contexts? What are we doing with contexts here? Um, Boy, I don't know. I'd like to talk with a few friends about this poem. A few friends who are familiar with Derek Walcott's poetry and with the poetry that from um, from the Caribbean. So I don't know, that phrase Caribbean covers a lot of different and different traditions of writing, but I'd be curious for readers and scholars working in the field of Caribbean literature, if they read this poem, how they would start to kind of organize it with respect to their own research, their own interests, their own knowledge of that history, for maybe a wider history of poems, thinking back. I can think of a few poems by Derek Walcott where he does this. Um, and I mentioning him only because he's a particular figure I'm pretty familiar with. Okay. Of Caribbean literature. Okay. Hmm. Okay, so identity, culture, identity. I mean, I think you have that you do have that sense of the sort of diasporic identity. Um, that sense of relocation or alienation from a home that you get, that Edward Said, for instance, theorizes in um, some of his writing that again you get in some of the literature of people who relocate from especially formerly colonized areas to various sort of European or American metropoles. I don't know if that's what's going on here. I don't know if that's the explanation for the separation. Um, it's very possible that is keeping this speaker feeling separated from a homeland, from a home, has nothing to do with travel elsewhere, but it might. Um, so sense of diasporic identity might be kind of at work. Sense of relocation or alienation. Hmm. You also get a sense of sign systems that I don't quite understand. This is very kind of old school structuralism. Um, but for instance, I don't necessarily know what a bula cake is. Um, where I grew up, we didn't have yam vines growing around houses. So there's a lot of kind of a cultural sign system that's being expressed here that is sort of hitting some notes that I imagine readers who are from certain parts of the world would immediately kind of plug into and recognize, so that the nostalgia then isn't just for the speaker but is a kind of effect produced by the poem for certain readers. And even if a reader like me doesn't share that sign system or didn't grow up plugged into it, um, there's a way in which I recognize the moves being made. And so like I did when I was talking a bit before, you start to try to associate it with the sort of the signs and the places where you grew up. Uh, okay. Concepts? I don't know. I don't know what sort of concepts I would want to pull from. I don't feel led at the moment into any kind of any specific sort of theoretical direction here. Might have to come back to this. Right. I would want to kind of learn if I were to sort of spend more time with the poem or try to develop a context in which to better understand it and to appreciate what it's doing. I think I would have to do quite a bit of homework first before then trying to apply some kind of theoretical concept to it. It feels a little wrong to me to sort of I don't know, jump to a framework like psychoanalysis, which is very interested in memory, um, and probably has quite a lot to say about nostalgia. It feels a little weird to jump to that before trying to learn a bit more about um, some of these other contexts I'm pointing to here. Okay, what about the world? I'd like to read the author's full collection, probably to get a better sense of that. Um, better understand or appreciate movements in contemporary Caribbean poetry. Hmm. Yeah, so I mean, look at this description that there are poems that are narrative poems, songs, fables. Okay, so you have a sort of rich range of different sorts of texts that apparently make up this cycle. Um, so we could get more specific than Caribbean. Just think about Jamaican poetry. Hmm. Right. So I think that's where I'm at in terms of the different contexts. I'm such a trained scholar that for me, and deep enough into a career in literary studies that for me the contexts that I come up with are probably not that shocking. I want to learn from the people who are experts in the say the traditions of the literatures that this poem may or may not think of itself or situate itself in um, people who think more about the issues of identity and culture that may or may not have something to do with the world that the poem is both expressing and situating itself in. And then, yeah, probably should read the whole collection before trying to push an understanding or an interpretation further. Okay, looking again. What do I think I'll see here that I might not be able to think about now? Sort of always the unfair question, right? That this step is probably best reserved for the actual experience of looking again. But yeah, I don't know. I wonder if I'll think more about the earlier stanzas and the life worlds expressed there, and less about the family dynamics of the closing stanza. Right, because that's really what captured my interest just a few minutes ago is what was going on in that last stanza. When maybe if I knew a bit more, or read a bit more, or learned a bit more from other scholars, from other poets, or from Walker herself, I might start to see things in those earlier things might stand out that just aren't right now because I don't recognize them. Okay, all right. So that's Walker's poem, Nostalgia. I was thinking the other day about a possible reaction to this channel, one that might worry that what I'm after is a kind of mastery of the poems I read. And I hope anyone who spends a few minutes listening to me doesn't come away thinking that that's what I'm after. That's why I talk about this as a process of getting to know the poem. Um, but just like meeting someone for the first time, you don't come away from those initial encounters knowing everything about them. In fact, you probably have a better sense of how little you know about them than you did before. And that's often the experience I have coming away from these poems, that there's a whole world of things I don't know. Um, and that if I just knew a little bit more or lived a little bit longer and learned more from other people, that the poem would become an even richer experience, an even richer one. Okay, mastery is not what I'm after, in other words. Okay, let's post that to me. Well, thanks for spending time with me with Christine Roseeta Walker's Nostalgia, and let's read more poems tomorrow.